And welcome to RealAg Live, everybody. I'm your host, Shaun Haney. Thanks a lot for tuning in today. We have a great discussion today on the markets. I'm really looking forward to it. If you have a question for our guest, we want you to join in the conversation, participate as much as possible. I know a few of you have already commented on Facebook that you're ready to go and you got your questions ready, so that's fantastic. If you're watching on Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube, don't hesitate to get your questions into the comment box, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. Today's guest is Neil Townsend of FarmLink Marketing Solutions. Neil, how are you?
I'm doing very well, Shaun. Thank you very much for having me on as a guest.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. We always have a good time talking markets here on RealAg Live. It's kind of on the go. We don't sometimes know what commodities will get brought up from the audience, but I know, Neil, you're up to the challenge. As long as we don't start talking about rough rice or something like that, you probably got everything else covered.
Probably, yeah. Not too familiar with rough rice and maybe the some of the more meat-based things. I'm not as up to date on those as well.
Well, we've got all the grains and oil seeds covered for sure. Neil, as you talk to the FarmLink clients across Western Canada, what are you hearing in terms of crop conditions? Obviously, we know the Peace has some challenges. Southeast Saskatchewan. What are you hearing?
Yeah, you right off the top, yes. Like I think parts of Southeast Saskatchewan and parts of Manitoba are, a little bit dry and, maybe struggling a little bit more than the farmer would like. I mean, I think the farmers and FarmLink takes the perspective that it's, June 25th, there's still, critical weather ahead. The critical weather could be detrimental, but it could also be optimal or be, an assist to the crop and an assist to the yield potential. But those are the two areas that we really are tracking right now as maybe a little bit deficient. And then there's other farmers that are, we've heard reports about, you'd expect at this time of year, but hail incidents and crops that have been, hailed out and planted to something else because they ran out of time for the primary crop that they were trying to grow. And, there are also some regions that have reported maybe excess moisture and are looking at a bit of a struggle for, maybe just a bit too much water, standing water that's on the fields there. Yeah.
And today on RealAg Radio, we had a farmer rapid fire, and we talked to Janine Paley. She's around the Edmonton area, or central Alberta, and they had 5 inches on the weekend. It's just talked to who was it? Chris Bauer, I think, at Lake Lenore. He was talking about they had like 11 inches so far this year, or 13 inches. Like that's a lot of water to deal with, Neil. We want moisture and some heat, but sometimes enough is enough.
Yeah, and it's all about timing, I guess. And that's why I think, one thing you could say about the biomatter or the seeds that we're using today is that if they get planted, they're pretty resilient. They do need certain things at certain times, but I mean, they have a survival instinct that's probably unparalleled in the history of, human agriculture. And again, that's why I say writing off a crop in June is bad practice nowadays.
Yeah, for sure.
And there are also, exceptional things happening. I mean, part of Siberia reported above the Arctic Circle, 38 degrees Celsius. That's sort of pretty uncommon temperature. I don't know exactly what's behind that or if the reading was accurate, but I mean, that was sort of blowing up Twitter yesterday and the previous few days about how hot it is above the Arctic Circle. Never recorded temperatures like that. Again, I think on the whole in Western Canada, we haven't seen too many extremes. And again, I'm not talking about anybody's particular farm or anything like that. It's just a widespread. And where we're at right now, I should give kudos to our excellent crop specialist, Alyssa Mistelbacher. And, we were kind of discussing this yesterday. And she said, right now you probably want to put in average yields for trend average yields for Western Canada, but there's room for improvement. But there's also, if we get a combination of extreme heat or, too wet, too cold, too dry, too hot, we could see a decline backwards.
Okay, so let's start off with some of the mainstays in Western Canada. The first one being canola. Are we penciling in if we're penciling in an average yield? Let's say we are.
Yep.
What does that mean here? A lot of discrepancy about what people think the carryout is from last year. What are you thinking about canola right now?
Yeah, and I think you nailed it there. The $64,000 question remains like just how much canola is in Western Canada. Like I think there's a wide range of estimates out there. I don't think we see. I guess over time it looks like maybe Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada and Stats Canada look a little better because I think there was a lot of estimates where there was an extra 2 or 3 million tons of supply. And as we drift towards the end of this year, it certainly doesn't feel like that. It doesn't feel heavy like that. We haven't seen a lot of pressure on the prices. And we've heard anecdotal reports that, it's relatively hard to score big tonnage in areas now. They're kind of picking up where they can pick it up. The other thing I think about, 2019-20 is that, like there's probably still upside, at least from the FarmLink estimates. Some other people might have already taken them up for the exports and let's call it domestic usage. We don't have the crush statistics weekly like we used to have, but, we have the monthly sort of ones from Stats Canada, and we have a weekly domestic disappearance from CGC. And again, I think like things start to look a lot better if you add in another 500,000 tons to the final usage numbers from this year, and you don't find any more canola. And of course, next week we're going to get some grain stocks reports from Stats Canada, and maybe we'll learn that there was a bit more than we thought there was, right? Again, I don't think the market turns on Stats Canada, but we'll watch it carefully. But yeah, like we have an improvement of in the ending stocks next year. We still, we're in the news, obviously, is the relationship between China and Canada. We are not sure. It doesn't look good. It doesn't look like it's going to be, resolved anytime soon. So we'll have to presume that, we're going to continue to struggle to put volume exports into China. But on the plus side, the European Union has another poor crop coming. They're not backing away in any way, shape, or form from their biodiesel mandate. And that should, access market for a proportion of Canadian canola, which, we did it this year and we should be able to do it again next year. So, yeah, it's improving, but we took our yield up week on week, and we're looking at about a 41.6 yield right now. And again, in areas, there's upside to that. And in other areas, people sort of are a little bit nervous about that.
So do you like new crop pricing right now then?
I think, there's upside from here, but it's going to be periodic, and it may even be geographic. So you'll see higher prices in some regions and it won't get there in other regions. But I think that, the farmers should prepare at this moment, knowing what we know now, for a similar type pricing structure for the last couple of years, where it kind of rolls in waves. You see sort of like the futures pick up from, 475, maybe they approach 500, but that 500 is a very hard nut to crack without seeing, really like close to 2 million tons for carryout or something like that. And then you'll see fallow periods where it just kind of drifts down to 470, 460. Now, obviously, Shaun, like we have to be, really keep our eyeballs on, what's happening with U.S. corn and U.S. soybeans and the trade and all that kind of thing. Like I do think that there is the potential for, corn to drag the entire complex a little bit lower.
Oh.
And, I know it's very like, this week, again, it's very early for corn. The critical weather is July and maybe mid-July to late July. But, somebody took a poll of analysts down there, and like over 50% of them thought that 180 was possible for a national.
180.
And that's just not what we want to see.
Oh, so, Neil, let's crawl under the table kind of news.
Well,
that's terrible. Oh, no.
It's not good. No, it's not good. And again, like the U.S. has to find a way to, like, they're recovering on the ethanol front, but obviously, like, a lot of, projections on demand and flows and things like that in terms of exports do depend on where this coronavirus is. And I think, if you and I had this conversation 2 weeks ago, we probably would have taken a more optimistic outlook on that. And the sad result right now is that it's, still running rampant, and not just in the United States, but in a lot of offshore countries as well, like Brazil and, critical components of the ag supply chain. India's got a really bad situation right now. So, how that impacts, I'm not so much talking about the supply chain disruptions. I'm talking more about how does that impact overall demand, and I think in the first phase of it, there was really like a benefit because we saw a lot of like food security. People were trying to ramp that up. And now we're probably on to, food security is important, but I think income security is very important now for a growing number of people. And again, we'll just have to wait and see. But I don't think even with the coronavirus as seen as a positive, and trust me, it's not a positive, but
know what you mean.
Seen as a positive, like I don't think there's enough sort of incremental demand that would create that solves the U.S. corn problem. I think ultimately our best bet for seeing some form of like mitigating circumstance outside of like a weather disruption would be that, China and the U.S. get along and there is a big phase one purchase of U.S. corn, but it can't be 5 million. It would have to be like 25 million tons of corn. And, why would the Chinese do that? I mean, it doesn't look like just on paper that they need it, but behavior in China does indicate that, perhaps stocks are tighter than the paperwork from the USDA or the IGC would suggest. And they're buying up their stored corn right now. They apparently bought cargoes from the US and Ukraine overnight. But again, these are small drips. But if they could do a big purchase, that would be very beneficial, I think.
Now, Neil, we on Real Agriculture, we've talked a lot about the U.S.-China Phase 1 deal. And I would say periodically I get an email from somebody in the audience that says, I don't understand why you're talking about this because we're in Canada. That's a trade deal between the U.S. and China. Should we not be focused on what Canada is doing with China or what Canada is doing inside of its deals? What is your sentiment on this? Because I have taken the position that, you know what, Canada's going to get some good flow through as sort of like being sort of the neighbor. There could be some good business for us to do if ships are leaving North America headed that direction. What are your thoughts on the importance of that deal to Canada?
Okay, well, I'm going to answer it two ways. One is macro and one is micro. The macro thing is, if you traditionally look at the United States as the world residual for, corn and soybeans and wheat, to have sustained higher prices, some price momentum, you need to whittle down United States stocks. And for whatever reason, if we just took 25 million tons of corn, 25 million tons of soybeans, and 20 million tons of wheat and just shifted them from the U.S. Account to the Chinese account, even if the Chinese just had it on their, they had it in storage there, we would improve the price structure of the world. So from a Canadian perspective, we are a competitor with the United States for sure, but we want to see them work through their stocks. And what's happened over the last 3 or 4 years is they've built tremendous stocks up. The wheat is relatively burdensome. The corn is going to be burdensome. And soybeans, they've just faced more and more competition. So from a macro level, we want them to get their stocks down. From a micro level, where could Canada benefit? Well, corn and soybeans, maybe we don't benefit directly, but I think any ton of corn or soybeans that kind of flows out of North America is a ton that isn't in North America. So that might improve like Western Canadian feed grain prices and marketing capabilities. And on the soybean side, I mean, it makes, soybeans that we do have in Manitoba or Southern Ontario just relatively, maybe potentially more valuable because they exist and there's less around. The area where I think we could greatly benefit from is if, as part of the Phase 1 China deal, the Chinese decide to restock hard red spring wheat and they buy 3 to 5 million tons of DNS. That doesn't come from anywhere because that's sort of, as the U.S. S&Ds look, like that's the one, like even though they have good storage on that, and the farmers are sort of like Charlton Heston's, like they're a little bit firmer holders of grain there than in other parts.
Out of my cold, dead hands.
Exactly. Not as bad as the Durham guys, but they're akin to the Durham guys. But I think that what happens from a Canadian perspective is that removes competition from some other markets, and we're able to get a bit more into some traditional U.S. hotspots, like even up our stake in Japan, or get into the Korean market a little more, or Philippines, or something like that. Because it, or even, really good is more north-south flow, where they take it out of the U.S. and we backfill some good quality protein wheat for all the pizza they want to eat down there and stuff like that. So yeah, I think on both, it could be beneficial on both the macro and micro levels. And I think farmers, they should always remember, now this has dissipated over the last 5 to 6 years because of the rise of Argentina and Brazil and Ukraine and Russia just becoming more and more dependable big producers. But you got to remember, corn is king. And, as corn goes, so goes the ag complex. And it comes down to not just prices, but even like the level of interest of speculators being in the market or investment into agriculture. And if, people look at the balance sheet and they see a $2.95 corn or a $3 corn, you just cut off a tap of money that is very beneficial for all of us in the ag space.
Which commodity would you say is the biggest Charleston Heston of the group? Is it canary seed?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, certainly some of the special crops people can have huge amounts of patience. I think canary seed is the classic example in Canada, sort of, the one that's maybe the bigger one where, people can actually influence the market. It has been durum. Like there's times where the durum sellers, have held on tight enough that it's opened the door for, Canadian into the US, or it's opened the door for, just a rise in prices. Now, again, it's a fine line. You gotta have the good pockets and good storage because, you can hold and then, you fall off the cliff or whatever. But, I would say also that the supply and demand balance sheet on durum does look fairly favorable going ahead right now. So even though we're growing a big crop with lots of acres, I mean, there looks like we could have a really robust export program in 2020-21.
John Kowalchuk, farmer from Alberta, he says flax. He thinks that's the group that holds off on selling.
Yeah, and I think flax is, you're going to have a lot of patience there because I think that, the ability of Canada to dictate the flax market has really dissipated over the last 5 to 7 years. I mean, I think demand is not growing as it's grown for even a lot of other things. And we've just got a lot of other suppliers capable of growing it and capable of storing it too, So I'd be a little bit wary of flax there. But, again, I mean, as long as it constitutes a relatively small proportion of your total farm operation, if you want to take a risk on one crop, I mean, I think flax is a good candidate. Canary seed, those ones that, where the market is pretty finite. I mean, again, we probably don't have that many growers in Western Canada, but one right now, which, just globally speaking, looks like, boy, there could be some tremendous opportunity in it, is chickpeas. Chickpeas, just for whatever reason, I mean, a multitude of countries have decreased their acreage and the production outlook has gotten a lot tighter. And, if you can grow some good caliber chickpeas, I mean, I wouldn't be quick to sell those because we could see some, increased upside. Now, obviously with pulses, you're always risking somebody who's just substitutes one in for another. But I think that's one that looks like it could have, globally speaking, a very tight supply and demand balance at the end of the year.
I had hummus and crackers for lunch. I'm doing my part. I'm doing my part.
Yeah. I love the chickpeas myself. So
you did mention. I just want to ask a follow-up question to canola, and you said that it's going to go in waves. And I looked at while you were talking there. I pulled up the November chart on canola trading 469.1 at this point. It's kind of canola's been kind of range bound when you look at the chart. Between 465 and 480. Is it that type of a range that you're just looking to make some incremental sales on closer up to 480, and if we get to 485, even better?
Yeah, I think if you need to have some early fall movement and you're not priced yet, you're probably looking at, 480 outside of sort of broader weather concerns. Obviously, the broader weather concerns kind of slow you down from selling because you might have the broader weather concerns yourself. Yeah. But I would say 480. But I think once everything gets sorted out, and as long as we don't get sort of a supply shock from a revision for 2 or 3 years ago that adds 1 million or 1.5 million tons to the, the supply and demand balance. And again, I would say one difference between, Canadian commodities and U.S. commodities is that, we basically take the USDA at face value. And when they tell us there's 3 billion bushels of corn carryout, we think there's 3 billion bushels of corn carryout. All Stats Canada does is just create more arguments across the coffee shops in Western Canada, right? It's another opinion. And I mean, the companies have one opinion and the farmers have another opinion. So I don't know, but I would say that I think that once we get the crop sorted out and we start to look at the 12-month demands from, August 1st to, July 31st, the actual 2020-21 marketing year, I think the wave will crest higher. I think we will get some points in time where we threaten to get to $500 futures and even a little bit above. We're going to need to see probably like strong early season exports to kind of get it so that, we can get through 500 and sustain above it. Otherwise, we're going to get there and then kind of come back down. But I think the low for next year might be a little bit higher than where we saw the futures low this year. We might not spend much time in the 450-ish range and more time in the 460-ish range in terms of, the low for the year or something like that.
Okay, Jim Hale farms in Lancer, Saskatchewan. He says canary stores better than flax. Have seen someone moving 4-year-old SRL. Look at that. That's tight hands.
Yeah, we've heard stories of 4, 5, 6-year canary seed supplies, and I think we joke about it in FarmLink. But semi-seriously is that there's like canary seed is something that we probably need to do more work on in terms of designing products that consumers want to eat, because it ticks a lot of the boxes that a modern consumer might want to have, but it's just not sort of promoted enough. So, we're adherents and believers in the value of canary seed at FarmLink.
You know what, Neil? Every time you say canary seed, I get itchy. Like it just.
Yeah, it is an itchy crop. I when I started at FarmLink, I'd never had much experience with it. And of course, like showing my ignorance, I thought it was an oil seed because, the seed part, like we always say, like sunflower seed and soybean seed and, canola seed. And it turns out it's a grain. But yes, I'm told that if you go into a field, you get very itchy.
Louise has a question about CWRS. What's your outlook for 2021?
Well, I guess the top line item would be more of the same with a back end risk that's amplified by the return of Australia to sort of a normal production. And the Australian production, because we're going into a La Nina, again, betting on La Nina or El Nino is a fool's game, but I'm a fool for it. There is a risk that Australian crop, crests 30 million tons, maybe 33 million tons. You never know. And they're going to have a lot more than they've had the last 2 years. So I think Canada is going to face like an intensified competition for, sort of January forward in the Pacific Basin. Countries like Indonesia, Sri Lanka, the Vietnam, Thailand, those markets are going to have much more Australian presence. And so I think that's going to be a risk. Now, granted, a lot of the Australian wheat maybe isn't as good as our 113.5, 114 CWRS, valid point. And so we should watch carefully what's happening in North Dakota, again, where we see this dryness, and also the HRW crop, which is being harvested. And last week, there was a lot of talk about lower protein, and then maybe the protein spreads would be widened. Again, I caution kind of taking too much, let the final results come in. And, the other thing that we have to bear in mind about the United States is when you're talking about their wheat there's so much in storage that, the stored wheat could have protein, so they just roll in the non-protein and roll out the protein wheat. Nobody's really sure on that. So, the protein slam home run isn't a slam dunk at this point, to merge two sports analogies.
Yeah, when we look at wheat, like we talk about, the Aussies and the Black Sea region, those pesky Russians. It's the same way that the U.S. in soybeans talks about South America. In terms of it's increased competition in some of these areas where, like you said before, they were not dependable, right? They had no infrastructure. They may be able to grow up, but they couldn't get the shit off the fields. And now it's changed, and it's we're having to evolve, and we got new competitors in the market.
Yeah, if you want to just cull it down to the brass tacks, it's one aspect of 4 incredibly dysfunctional countries that works. Ukraine, basket case, Russia, basket case, Brazil, basket case, Argentina, basket case. Nobody would think let's bet on those economies, but their ag sectors work. And, their governments, as inept as they are, they realize that it's very, very important for them to facilitate agricultural exports and access, hard currency and have some sort of thing that people can be involved in. Argentina is maybe the worst of the bunch because they use it as a piggy bank for the government. But and I think one thing is you look at a country like Nigeria, which, imports quite a bit of wheat, every year. And they tend to want, I mean, it's a market that was cultivated by the U.S. Wheat Associates and the CWB back in the past, and they got Nigeria sort of hit, like hooked on better quality wheat than probably they needed. But, what's happened is the Russians have come in there and become a dependable supplier, and also given the Nigerian millers a good quality wheat for them to mill. And I mean, that's the kind of market that Russia has the chance to disrupt. And now, when they have a bigger supply and with cheap ocean freight rates, I mean, they're doing the same thing in places like, potentially, Indonesia, which is another hugely important market. And it will be interesting this year just to see Indonesia, like with the Australians back and the Russians, maybe like right now it looks like they're getting a better, bigger crop than maybe was expected a month ago, that, we could see some, prolonged, competition there, and it's a market that really Canada, with just the S&D as wheat is configured, we do need that.
Yeah, good point. Interesting stuff. You're right though. You think about the political situations in all those countries, it's not exactly super stable. Or necessarily a country would be like, you know what? I'm setting up business in Russia. That's a great idea. Let's do that. It just doesn't happen. But they're competing with us very, very well.
And it's also interesting too that two of the places that are really struggling with coronavirus are Brazil and Russia, for example. And I mean, I just think like it shows you that it doesn't take much to derail sort of whenever we talk optimistically about those places, it doesn't take much to disrupt them. Now, the coronavirus is hugely disruptive to even the most stable and, forthright economies, but it's really wrought damage in Russia and Argentina. And moreover, because it's wrought so much damage there, like some of the countries that have sort of depended recently on, Russian support have also seen their economies really tighten up and be severely impacted.
Next week, we're going to see the implementation July 1st for the USMCA deal. We've got some changes to declarations. We have to declare now all crops that are delivered to elevators. When I'm on RFD TV in the U.S. every morning, or we obviously broadcast every day on Rural Radio 147, there's a lot of interest from the U.S. side about, now we're going to be, our wheat will be treated fairly in Canada. Do you see much changing trade flow wise because of the USMCA change? Sure, that I should add, wheat lobby groups on both sides of the border were pushing for this change. So how do you see, does this have any impact?
Yeah, I mean, I just my experience between the U.S. and Canada is that, on a farmer level, Canadian farmers are looking to the U.S. more than Canadian farmers are looking to the U.S. more than U.S. farmers are looking to Canada. Yeah. So it's going to take a lot to shake U.S. behavior, like to change them. They like to do things the way they do. But on the sort of, again, like the next level up, I mean, we do have an accomplished class of arbitrageurs. And those arbitrageurs will try to take advantage of it. And moreover, they probably should try to take advantage of it because, I mean, if there's not an equilibrium in prices, I mean, the job of the market is to find an equilibrium in prices, right? And the one area where I think it could confuse matters and you could see some sort of, response, we're going to have to be very careful is, when wheat is brought up or whatever crop is brought down or up, and it ends up sort of going into an export channel. And then you've got, your country of origin things. And I think we just have to be wary of what the end users offshore are going to think about North America and whether or not it will just become like one blended kind of market. But right now it isn't. I mean, those countries will insist that if they buy Canadian wheat, they want it to be Canadian wheat, right?
Well, and the
how will they
MRLs, things like that. Like there's some things that have to come into parallel here a little bit.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
I got another question here from Louise who says, Neil, what about geopolitical events that we should be watching that could influence the grain market?
Well, I mean, the first one is, I think, U.S. and China. We've talked about that quite a bit. And China and Canada and China and India and China, and, China's sort of like simultaneously, trying to poke hornets' nests all over the world. So I think that's one that we would probably like to see. And I think like one thing, if you just look on the geopolitical level, like, coronavirus has, brought a lot of the economies around the world into a point of great struggle. I think that the way to ease that struggle, my opinion, would be cooperation and freer flowing trade as opposed to more trade restrictions and more tariffs and those kinds of things. I think that, the world economy will recover faster and the quality of life for people who've been affected by this will improve at a steadier rate if we don't waste a lot of time arguing amongst ourselves. The other one I think that we all have to be a little bit cognizant about, and this is a little bit more particular, is, the U.S. re-election and some of the ag policy things that could, fall out of it. And, like the ethanol policy would be one, broader trade policy, the largesse, all of the programs in the U.S. have told farmers to do exactly what they're doing. The world market is trying to tell U.S. farmers, hey, buddy, you might be one of the high cost producers. Could you back off a bit on your corn acres? Could you back off on your soybean acres? They're not getting that message because the government is softening the blow. And, that's something that we can punt down the field a few times, but at some point it's going to come back and bite us all. And what it's going to do is it's going to put us into a place where, we just have a lower for longer price regime. That's, we're going to struggle more, and we might, $7 wheat might be, harder to obtain, or, $5 corn in southern Manitoba might be, something that your dad told you about, right? For a few years, right? So again, like it ultimately is a zero sum game with agriculture, and it's a highly, highly distorted market by all of the governments that influence it. I mean, we have one of the governments that stays out of it the most. The Australians probably have the second government that stays out of it the most. The rest of the world is very active at disrupting agricultural markets and supporting farmers.
Yeah, I get the question all the time from Canadian farmers. Why in the Midwest do they only grow those two crops? And I think the answer is simple. There's no incentive to not. Like that's how the system is set up that way, and it's encouraged. So what you really shouldn't be surprised. And I think sometimes we in Canada have this illusion that the U.S. is a freer, open more market than we have, and there's much more programming and sort of puppet strings in behind the scenes than we have here in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, there's no denying that, if you're just looking at the volume you can get off of an acre, I mean, corn is very well suited to be grown in Iowa, right?
Yep.
I think the question mark is it the best option for somebody to grow in North Dakota or South Dakota? And the answer is yes, with the varieties, it certainly kind of is, but it's really the benevolence of the U.S. government to just keep people doing what they're always doing. And it's great for Canadians. I mean, look at one of the expansion markets that we've captured because the U.S. just decides they don't want to be in the business of growing it, oats. I mean, and oats is sort of like this wonder product. It's gluten-free. It's probably the best non-dairy alternative you can get because it's just oats soaked in water, and it tastes like milk. It has a better flavor than almond milk and all these other ones, in my opinion, and a lot of consumers' opinions too. So, yes, I think Canadians should be happy in one sense that sort of program is there. The downside is when you get a year coming up like 2021, and it's going to be a very hard year to really make a lot of conclusions about because there's so much other noise in the market with coronavirus and the trade wars and all this. But when U.S. policy ends up in a situation where there's 4 billion bushels of U.S. corn carryout, you're back into like your dad, Shaun, and my dad, like the history of U.S. agriculture is provide some form of incentive to an American farmer. They respond better than you expect. And in 5 to 10 years, you got more of the stuff than you know what to do with. Then you design a program that's sort of like, you store it, you ship it to other countries, ethanol, and we're back in where they need another program now. And is it going to be like going from 10 to 15 to 20% on ethanol inclusion? Maybe, but it's such a political hot potato that, the will to do that. And that's why the U.S. election in November, Biden or Trump, I mean, it's, some people see it as an existential thing, but it's also a very important thing because, Biden is not going to win based on, how many peat farmers in Iowa vote for him, and he knows that he's going to win, in other places, right? So will his kindness towards like those red state areas be the same as Trump? And Trump has really delivered very little for the farmers despite all his promises. I mean, the biggest one would be this, sort of these checks that they're going to get written here for the trade war and for the coronavirus. But, he hasn't made anything that's going to solve the problem for the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, he's just put in place like the ethanol mandate's the same, and they're have tough competitors. Now, one thing that could change, final point, is there does seem to be some momentum, and again, I am no expert on foreign exchange. If I were an expert on foreign exchange, I'd be living on a yacht in the Mediterranean and partying with Leonardo DiCaprio. But there does seem to be a lot of consensus that the U.S. dollar is going to be lower, both from sort of like a policy point of view and sort of a structural point of view. And that could be also a threat to places like Canada, Argentina, Brazil, because if the U.S. has a lower dollar, lowering the cost to get it out, that could really rapidly increase their export flow.
Kara says, Neil, you should give that oat speech to Tim Hortons. You got to get on that one. Sell more oat milk.
I'd love to see it there. It really is. My son is sort of lactose intolerant, and he's tried them all. And then we bought some oat milk at Costco, and he just says, "Dad, this is the best stuff. I love it." And he gave me a glass that he chilled in the fridge, and I said, "Boom, this is really good." So. Yeah,
hey, Neil, you mentioned chickpeas earlier. Of course, lentils have had some very good pricing here in the spring of 20. We've had a whole series of rollouts and announcements by Protein Industries Canada. We're trying to build up that domestic processing sector for pulses. What's your thoughts on what we're doing long term to really establish ourselves as the leader, the spot to be in the world in this space? Because all you got to do is turn on Fox Business, CNBC in the morning, and they're talking about plant proteins. Obviously, Canada's a big pork and beef player too, but what do you think about how we're setting ourselves up for the future here in the plant protein space?
Yeah, I mean, I like it. I think that, it's the age-old question. I mean, can you do value adding on the prairies? And here we found some things that we can do value adding for, and in a market that is unequivocally growing, right? I mean, it just seems like there's more demand for this stuff. And again, I think you see what happened in, unfortunately in High River and other parts, like in Iowa with the meat supply chain. And again, like whenever you sort of, see behind the curtain of how a kill factory works or whatever slaughterhouse works, I mean, it doesn't look good. I mean, and you might encourage a few more people to buy one more meal of something else. Again, I mean, I'm not advocating that people switch over to just a plant protein diet, but I think it's here to stay. I think it's going to grow. I don't think it's going to grow as fast as people expect. I mean, there was a note today that McDonald's has taken it off the menu sort of quietly. They don't have any plans to replace it. And I think that a lot of people, it's going to be sort of a one and done, like, oh, I tried it. It wasn't bad, but, whatever. I think that the other thing I'd say about pulses, we do have a little bit of worry of pantry preparedness where we've sold a lot, on the coronavirus, and maybe people haven't used them and they'll be there for a little while. But the other thing I'd say, just, I think there's a lot of other uses for these plant proteins than just making like Beyond Meat or Impossible Foods burgers. And those are also growing as well, like dog foods and animal feeds and, other nutritional aspects. So it's here to stay. And I strongly encourage them. I mean, I think it's great to just have investment in Western Canada that diversifies us a little more and gives a farmer the chance to kind of, break out of the traditional supply chains. And the other thing too, I think, and farmers can maybe correct me on this, but there's always been somewhat of a risk in the pulse market about, either a change in Indian policy or, some, worries about getting paid. When you see these value-added plants in Western Canada, the bigger ones like with Roquette and very dependable big companies, I mean, I think that's a good outlet, and also you're probably going to get a check that clears.
And that's important in some periods of our history. Let me tell you. Question here from James. He's watching on Facebook. I think a general commodity question, so I think it's a little bit commodity dependent, but do your best here. In terms of using your grain bin as a profit generator, does it make sense to hold stocks for a future marketing opportunity or sell now?
Overall, my viewpoint is that, trying to time the market, especially across different marketing years, is very, it's not going to reward you that often. And, time and space are worth money. If you sell something earlier because you're, very stubborn about something else, there's an opportunity cost on that. That being said, I think that, when you're marketing your crops, at a minimum, it should be an 18-month experiment or process. You should start 6 months before the crop year, and you should try to have, it planned to all be gone on, July 31st. But on occasions where you notice a market that's sort of not in equilibrium, or a market that seems to be offering some opportunity, be it a local or a regional or a national or an international market, use your storage to your advantage. And use your storage to generate income. But, you have to really see all the moving pieces and understand the concept of opportunity cost and understand why you're doing it and what your hope is. And again, one thing I'm a big proponent of is total farm approach. You have to look at all aspects of your farm and have a strategy for everything that can generate revenue for you, and basically make sure that all the pieces add up to the entire pie.
I think sometimes we underestimate the new crop risk. Like, think about canola as an example. I think you said, a 41 bushel average potentially in canola. The what if of a 46? And what does, or a 50, you know what I mean? Like, we don't know. I talk to farmers across the country, and a lot of them are saying, I'm, we got a long ways to go, but I may have a good crop here if this all works out. And that, we know what that does to prices if supply goes higher without a change in demand. So I think we got to keep that in mind too when you're holding that old crop past that August 1st date. So interesting stuff. Hey, Neil.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Quick thing here, Shaun. I think what you said is absolute gold, and I think the readers or your listeners and watchers who've sent in things, they're onto something. And one of the big things is that, it's a bird in the hand and two in the bush type of thing. And if we look just at 2020-21, we understand, and I think, Canadian farmers really, since maybe the end of the CWB, are starting to understand more and more how much of an international aspect everything is, like they're not sheltered from that. And, when you just look at that year and you think one job that farmers should be doing at this point in time is taking an acre and locking in a profit on that acre and trying to reduce risk on the entire farm, because there is no guarantee just from the worldwide supply and demand balance that, when we have this conversation next year at the tail end of the coming new crop year, that we're not going to be talking about, like, why have prices been in the toilet for the last 3 months? What happened, right? Yeah. That is a palatable risk, because the U.S. could end up with 4 billion bushels of carryout for corn.
Neil, this has been so much fun. Great stuff. Awesome insight. We went 45 minutes. I said we would only go to 40, but we kept you a little bit longer. I really, really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you very much, Shaun, and keep doing the great work out there.
Hey, you too. Everybody, check out FarmLink Marketing Solutions. Neil and the gang there do a fantastic job. They've got agents across Western Canada trying to help you do a better job of marketing your crop and managing the total farm approach. That was good. I like that saying that Neil provided. I really appreciate everybody tuning in. Check out RealAg Radio on Rural Radio 147. It's coming up today at 4:30 Eastern. Today's a Farmer Rapid Fire. There is no RealAg Live tomorrow because it's Friday, but to be a RealAg Issues panel on RealAg Radio tomorrow. I believe on Tuesday next week for RealAg Live, we've got Carlo Day, the Canada West Foundation. We'll be talking some trade deals. Carlo always has some interesting stuff to say. Thanks, everybody, for getting real and getting connected with RealAg Live. I almost said radio. Get real and get connected with RealAg Live, and have a good day, everybody. Cheers.